Hi, everybody. My name is Valerie Worthington, and this is the latest in a series of conversations I'm getting to have with my really smart friends and colleagues who train Jiu-Jitsu and who also happen to be really smart in other areas as well. And today I get to chat with Betsy O'Donovan, who is a journalist, and Julia Kelly, who is a scientist. And both of them have been kind enough to speak with me before, and now we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the realm of conspiracy theory and the implications of that in the time of something like a pandemic. So thanks so much, Betsy and Julia, for joining me. I'd like to ask you first, Betsy, if you would be willing to summarize a video that made the rounds called Plandemic from a journalistic perspective and explain the issues with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a particularly interesting thing because it is hard to find it online now because there have been assiduous attempts to take the video down after it was fact checked and thoroughly debunked. So it keeps popping up. It's like a really, really tough weed in the garden. You just have to get to the roots and keep digging. But essentially, Plandemic is a pretty short, web-friendly documentary with high production values. It looks like something that could appear on TV. That, to just keep the summary super tight, that claims that the coronavirus was created in order to force people to vaccinate and to increase the number of vaccinations and to enrich people who stand to benefit from that system. And there is a lot of what are the hallmarks of conspiracy videos, that the media is, because it is not covering it, it must be complicit, because media companies are also owned by rich people. And some of these other hallmarks of these videos that the lack of coverage is obviously the thing I'm super attuned to, because you kind of, if you actually search Google News for coverage of Plandemic, it's everywhere, but and has been thoroughly addressed. But there is still this sense of there's a secret knowledge. And that's actually, to talk about what the journalism issues are with this, one of the things that's really interesting about conspiracy theories is that they are often given a structural means to flourish. And what I mean by that is, like, the reason that we see more conspiracy theories today than we used to see 30 years ago or 40 years ago are a couple of things that really changed, both about how we access media and how it's regulated. When people talk about the Wild Wild West, they really do mean the internet right now. So I'm just going to be super quick on this, but one thing that happened, so Plandemic is not an Alex Jones product, but it is Alex Jones adjacent. Alex Jones is a famous conspiracy theorist on the internet. And Alex Jones is part of a cohort of people who began to move into conservative talk media and then into conspiracy media in the 1990s after the FCC stopped enforcing what's called the Fairness Doctrine. And this, forgive me for like the boring history lesson here, but I swear to you, it's actually super relevant to your daily life. And it's this. When the Federal Communications Commission first allowed corporate entities to access the airwaves, which we believe belong to, as Americans, we believe that those are public good, like trees and water. They belong to the people, and the rights to them are granted by the government. So when the government gave institutions access to the airwaves, they also made some rules that said you have to have balanced coverage. There has to be an educational component. It has to be accurate and fair, and it has to pass the test of reasonableness. And stations could lose their licenses for airing unsupported facts, errant nonsense, misinformation. When the FCC stopped enforcing the Fairness Doctrine in the 1990s, which was eventually gutted in the early 2000s, what happened is you saw this rise of unregulated speech that was broadcast. So it's one thing to stand on your street corner and shout at 20 people. It's a different thing to have a radio station or a network of radio stations behind you amplifying what may be wrong. And then, of course, we saw the rise of the internet, which only increased this problem because even as lightly regulated as radio is, it still has some regulation versus the internet, where speech is the purest form of free, which means you can say literally anything that you want without anyone verifying it, and no one can stop you. Um, so one of the things we see with Plandemic is it spread wildly on Facebook because, again, there's this, there are no gates that stop us and force us to check the accuracy of our information before we distribute it. And that's an enormous structural problem because without that structure that says, wait, we're going to run this by an independent third party, it's up to individual people's behavior. And I will say one of the things, there was a really interesting study that was done in 2017 that looked at whether, for example, when misinformation is spread on Twitter, whether it is more likely to be spread on bots, which was our operating theory for a while in media, or if it was being spread by people. And it turns out people are much more likely to spread conspiracy theories of a particular type than bots are, which is shocking. But what that means is we're each responsible for our own behavior, and we're so behind in our ability to assess information and vet it, and our cultural habit of requiring other people to do that, that we see this like really, if we want to return to the weed analogy, it's like somebody has prepared a garden bed and just let nature take its course. And what we're finding is that doesn't produce super nutritious information in our ecosystem. But I'm super curious what Julia has to say about all of this, because I'm a journalist and I can assess how information is presented, but you're the scientist. So what does the science say?
So I think the most important, or the thing that really started it is, so the first 10 minutes is devoted to this doctor, Dr. Judy Mikovich, talking about how she was persecuted for her research and the government's trying to cover it up. And she has a PhD and she did work. I don't know that she ever actually worked directly with Dr. Fauci, but they were in a very similar department. They both worked on HIV.
She received grants from a grant making institution that he ran.
Okay. Yeah, so, and that was for the work on HIV, and she says that he stole her work, and then she says that she found, basically, her big thing is she says a paper was retracted, a paper which said all of these cell lines for people with chronic fatigue syndrome are infected with a murine virus, so a mouse virus called XMRV. And this was in 2009, I think. And I vaguely remember this paper being published, and it was huge. It was big news because we didn't know what caused chronic fatigue syndrome. And by 2011, the paper had been retracted because, this is the real reason, nobody could replicate the study. So all of science is based on, if I can do it, somebody with similar training, similar equipment, in a similar lab needs to be able to do it as well. And nobody could replicate her findings. So what happened was the journal retracted the study. And she actually participated in a study afterwards with Dr. Fauci where she could not replicate her own findings. So unfortunately, this led to a lot of bad publicity for her. Paper getting retracted from Science is very bad. And then she was fired from her post because they really couldn't tell if she had faked her findings or she was just negligent in her science and just allowed for contamination. And neither of those are good for somebody that's running a multi-million-dollar lab. She then ended up stealing equipment and lab notebooks, which you are not allowed to do. That's illegal. So the documentary started with her saying that she was arrested and basically repeatedly thrown in jail for 5 years, which is not true. She's saying she's arrested for basically speaking out what the government didn't want people to find out. That's not true. She was arrested for theft. And then after that, she couldn't find a job because she had stolen from her employer. She had been fired for negligence. And so what happened was, and why this documentary got made is she fell in with that conspiracy crowd because they would pay her, and they could pay her to be the spokesperson for whatever theory that she came up with or somebody else would come up with. And the thing is, if you look at her research, her original research had nothing to do with vaccines. There's no actual data to support the vaccination. What there is there's data from 10 years ago saying I used to be a good scientist and they covered up my work and this is why they covered it up. But there's no supporting data in those 10 years bridging to where we are now, which is that a third of vaccines are contaminated with retroviruses. And the coronavirus was grown in a lab because there's no way that it could have mutated in the wild. So yeah, that's about where we are scientifically with that video.
Thanks, Julie. So one of the things that strikes me is that both journalism and science are at a disadvantage time-wise because, Betsy, you mentioned this idea of needing to vet things with a third party. And it sounds like the procedure there for journalism and science is very similar in that you make claims, you verify those claims before you circulate those claims. And so with something like a Plandemic, where that doesn't seem to be happening, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, then the journalism and the science are sort of a step behind because they're going to do their due diligence. But the due diligence has happened, as both of you have mentioned, and so I'm interested in your perspective on that aspect of it that I just mentioned, and also what causes people to continue to believe once a credible process has taken place to debunk information. And I'll let you decide who wants to go next.
So I will just say, as you were talking, Julia, one of the things I was thinking about is the fact that reproducibility is a critical component of journalism, right? Part of why we try to avoid using anonymous sources unless there is literally no other alternative means to get that information is because we want the worst scandals in journalism have happened because nobody followed behind a journalist to verify their story. Mm-hmm. And so there are increasingly robust processes in place to do what is a much, 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 much lighter, a 1% peer review, where people can, with the same training and same information and same starting points, can reproduce your work and validate it. So yeah, there absolutely is a connection there, and it is this process that makes us slower off the mark. And one of the things we see just on the regular is that because we have to check every single nuance of a claim, whereas someone else has the advantage of like just making it up out of whole cloth instantly, we don't just lag, we lag significantly behind them. And I know, I'm curious, Julia, whether you feel that science, that's just a structural advantage for all of us, but I'm curious whether you feel that science, we're seeing a lot of preprints right now, and other things that are intended to speed up the release of information for people. Do you mind talking a little bit about what science is doing in this regard in case we can learn from you?
Yeah, so I actually had written a note about preprints because I have, obviously everybody's got questions and everybody's doing their own research, which I wholeheartedly support because I think people should be educated. But I don't think people understand quite yet the difference between a preprint and a published scientific article. So there's so many preprints coming out because the journals want us to know what's going on. So if other scientists are working on the same thing, we see that data and we can kind of collaborate and work together. Like the entire scientific community is working on the coronavirus right now, and we want to collaborate as much as possible. But preprints haven't gone through the peer review process as much as a scientific paper has. And it's something to remember with all of these papers that are coming out. The hydroxychloroquine study that came out was not rigorously peer reviewed and ended up being retracted, the original one. A lot of the statistical papers looking at antibodies have not been peer reviewed, so the math hasn't been peer reviewed. And I'm not saying that they're poorly designed or we shouldn't trust them, but they do need to be taken with a grain of salt because they haven't gone all the way through the process. Right now, it's basically like a science report done by the best scientists in the world, but there's always somebody looking on the outside that's going to catch that one thing that you missed. And I think that's something that people need to keep in mind. Case in point, today, the Moderna trial, the first release of the Moderna trial came out, and it's super exciting because I think 8 of the participants that they've looked at so far have antibodies. And I'm 100% supporting this going all the way. I want this vaccine to be licensed. I want this pandemic to be over, but it's also only 8 people out of 60 that they've released data for because they haven't analyzed the rest yet. So it's promising, but this doesn't mean that suddenly everything's going to change. And so I think people need to start understanding that data is being released a lot faster than it usually is right now. It's being released so that other scientists can build on it and we can collaborate. But unfortunately, that also means that people who, like journalists, are seeing it and they might be thinking that it's the final print, or this is something that we need right now. And it's not all journalists. Some places are better equipped to handle scientific reporting. But right now, also, everyone just wants to print either really good news or really bad news.
Yeah. I'm very glad you brought up Moderna, actually, because one of the things that Val had mentioned earlier is profit motive, right? Mm-hmm. And I think to pull back to Plandemic, one of the things that's quite interesting that's happening right now is that, we tend in the States, I think, to see misinformation, whatever you think the misinformation is, through a politically partisan lens. Mm-hmm. And we assume that, I can scan most of my friends' Facebook pages and make a rough bet on how they typically vote based on what they share, as we all can. And, I love it when I'm surprised, but I think we have all become sophisticated about understanding our friends as sources, right? Mm-hmm. And what biases they hold, which is less visible when we're looking at random story on the internet. So one thing I wanted to bring up with the profit motive is our American perspective assumes partisanship, but the partisanship really only comes in the distribution part. Mm-hmm. It is less common when it comes up in the creation part. One of the things, Plandemic is particularly interesting because there is an obvious worldview behind it. But one of the things that we know is conspiracy theories are a really fantastic way to make money. Whether you are talking, and I say this as I'll just full disclosure, y'all, I wouldn't describe myself as a prepper, but I am definitely the grandchild of people who weathered the Depression, and I act like it. And so, one of the things you see is, for example, people who in the prepper community have a financial interest in amping up your concern about how ready you are and what threats you're ready for. Oh, you're ready for the earthquake? Well, do you have the hurricane kit? And trying to sell you things. And it's important to be skeptical of those people. Whenever there's a product or an ad that's bundled with somebody's information, my antenna go up. And this is something I would recommend for everybody. When you're looking at something, look to see if there is any way of attaching ad revenue to it. So YouTube is famous for this. You can choose where you insert your ads. You barely have to do any work, and you can just generate an amazing amount of money. There are also, this is not relative to the Plandemic video, but one of the things we observed in 2016, and that's continuing as we head toward the 2020 election, is these nonpartisan players who are right now, hang on, let me get the name of the city because I looked this up right before our conversation just so I could get it correct. There's a city called Velis, Macedonia, that is the fake news factory of the world. And they make money because they are able to produce videos and content that they can attach advertising to. And as you guys can probably guess, the more shocking the claim, the more eyes you get on it, the more money you make. So it's not in anybody's interest to make rational, reasonable claims. It's in everybody's interest. This is often what the media gets accused of amplifying threats in order to make money. And what I will say is, well, that is not how media organizations that I have been associated with, or I would say most of the legacy media in the States, that's not how they operate, because they want the return clicks from people who trust them. It is absolutely how some media operates, and typically the media that operates that way is the media you should be most afraid of. So,
Yeah,
and I'm
so
curious, is there a profit motive in science in that way too?
what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we hear is like the drug companies are going to make money off of this, or I'm sure we're going to hear the science. Like most people don't realize that it actually costs a lot of money to get your work published in journals. This is not like a cash on the barrelhead enterprise.
Yeah. So being a scientist is by and large not lucrative. Um, and I have heard a lot about the drug companies are benefiting from this pandemic, basically. Like they're profiting. And I mean, certain companies, they have drugs that are being tested right now, they're profiting, but they're not doing it maliciously. It's just that they had this drug that somebody thinks might work, and they're like, yeah, sure, take it. The big thing is vaccines are not profitable for drug companies. And I think that's something that gets spun by various media sources. Usually the fringe media sources they're all talking about the vaccines. They want us to buy their vaccines so they can make money and we get sicker. But first of all, vaccines don't make you sicker. Second of all, they're not profitable because they prevent disease. So it's a one-off treatment, which is not profitable. And usually they're going to have to sell them very cheap because vaccines like the coronavirus vaccine, they're going to have to get it to every corner of the world. And a significant portion of the world's population cannot pay for that. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they're helping to bridge that divide. SEPI is helping to bridge that divide, but they're not going to make a lot of money off of this. And also, 95% of the vaccines that are in trials right now are going to fail. So they're putting out millions of dollars to get this vaccine into trial. There's 45 vaccines, and I would be surprised if more than 4 were licensed. But they dropped everything. I'm not trying to say that pharmaceutical companies are saints. Obviously, they're profit driven, but they dropped everything and they were like, make the best product. We want this in the pipelines. Do they have other motives? Like right now, a lot of IV drugs are not being used. A lot of cancer drugs are not being used. So the pharma companies are losing money because people aren't buying the more advanced drugs because they have to be administered in a hospital. So there is a profit motive, but I wouldn't say that it's the evil profit motive that everyone's talking about. It's a we want to return to business as usual, so we're going to throw every resource we have right now at it.
I'm sorry, Val. I don't mean to keep
No,
interrupting.
go ahead. Go ahead. I want to hear you.
What I was going to say is something that another analog between media and science, right, is what is valuable to you needs to be considered. And to a lay person, I'm not sure it's always obvious that there are differences in value, right? Like I would Sackler Pharmaceuticals and like, you know, the opioid epidemic. What's the best, most lucrative drug? Get somebody hooked on something that they need every day or multiple times a day. And, you know, speaking of the sins of big pharma, but that's the goal, right? Is the repeated user who depends on you as a habit. So
Yeah.
whether that's because you need treatment for breast cancer or because you need insulin, those are the, you know, and insulin's relatively cheap to make, but it's still, those are the users who are most valuable over a lifetime. Same thing is true in newsrooms. If you burn somebody with bad information, they will not come back to you, is one of the value propositions of journalism. Like our goal is to be trusted over time by people who remain my news organization's coverage. And so my news organization's coverage has to be satisfying to them. And I think that's an interesting analog, and people don't really understand, like, it's not a quick cash grab, because sure, you might grab the cash, but then what happens to the day after? So anyway, that's just a passing thought. It looks like you had something you wanted to ask.
Well, I'm listening to you talk, and and the way you're describing it, the way you're describing both science and journalism, indicates that both of them are populated by people who do their best and sometimes make mistakes, and sometimes the mistakes need to be retracted or need to be addressed, but there is a structure in place for making sure that the best possible information, the best possible science is what's propagated. And given that that's the case, I'm curious about, and this is asking you to dive into the psyche of people you don't know, which probably isn't fair, but what's the attraction of believing what's the word I'm looking for? I can't, a conspiracy theory. What's the attraction of believing something like that in the face of the fact that journalism and science, although imperfect, do police themselves?
Mm-hmm. Julie, do you have thoughts about this? I'm happy to dive into, but
I have a couple. If you want me to go first, or if you want to go first.
Why don't you go first, Julia?
Okay. So I think part of it, at least on the scientific side, is, first of all, science is very difficult to understand, and scientists are not very good at communicating science. We're generally socially awkward, and we are generally used to using a lot of jargon. And it's not until recently that people started, like classes started addressing, you need to be able to explain this to somebody, because if you can't, somebody else will. So I know a lot of people that are not able to explain their research to somebody that doesn't have more than a high school degree, and you should be able to do that because you should understand your research that well. And conspiracy theories are very good at targeting people who don't have backgrounds in science. And they are very good at explaining and breaking it down into something that's very understandable, partly because they simplify what's actually going on. And the other part of that is, at least in my experience, especially here, is they have a villain, and people don't like not having a reason why everything's going wrong. So a virus that crawled out of a jungle or a market in Asia, that's scary because it could happen again. But a virus that the government made and sent out to people, well, if we police our government better, we can stop it from happening. So it creates both an enemy and a solution that science is a lot slower to. There's not usually an enemy, and the solution is usually a lot longer to achieve.
Mm-hmm. That tracks with a lot of what I've observed, and I'm going to preface this by saying, like, this is an enormous field of research in my field, so I will give you some broad strokes, but if it's okay, Val, I'll also follow up with some stuff that you might use as supplemental material.
Love it.
That will express it better than I can. But one of the things we've seen is that, of course, confirmation bias is a real thing, right? People want to have their preconceived notions supported by data. One of the other things that we find that conspiracy theories do really effectively is what we understand that one of the few things that data is really bad at changing people's minds. We love to think that we are rational. Oh my gosh, if I could have a nickel for every time someone said rational or logical in an argument on the internet, or do your research, I would be so rich. But what we find is people like to think that we're logical and rational, but very few, our minds are very difficult to change. Once we develop a frame of reference or an idea about how something works, it's very, very hard for new information to budge that over the long term. It may cause a temporary blip where you kind of reflect on that new information, but it doesn't go into your long-term processing and decision making. What is super effective, and this is another hallmark of conspiracy theory videos in particular, what is super effective is storytelling. So how many of you guys have ever gotten a Nigerian prince email, right? Or most scams rely on a story because we are storytelling creatures. Our brains are a privileged storytelling as a process. And it helps sink things deeper into our long-term memory when we are able to attach stories and images to them. And stories convey images really clearly. So we remember movies more clearly than we remember the specifics of text. So one of the things that conspiracy theories do really well is they attach somebody, my cousin's friend, this woman I knew in Vermont, to a story and describe what happened to them and describe the effects in really specific and kind of horrible ways. That's why this Plandemic video has a character at the front at the beginning of the story. She's been wronged by the system. She's been thrown in jail. She's, had every terrible thing happen to her, and she's struggling through for us, the people, right? We need characters and story arcs. One of the other things that we sort of notice with conspiracy theories and why they spread so quickly is they spread from multiple directions. So the anti-vaxxer movement is not a conservative or a liberal movement, it is both. You see people who believe that vaccines do harm. I'm related to people who believe that vaccines do harm because they will extrapolate from, for example, one poorly controlled vaccine, for example, which has happened because that is how science happens. We try things, we have safety measures in place, but sometimes, you have the Dalcon shield or whatever, which is not a vaccine. In case anyone's wondering, I know it's not a vaccine. But the thing that sort of happens is if you want to have a really successful conspiracy theory, you want to speak to people who have some degree of skepticism and a certain amount of knowledge. Actually, a certain amount of education is really helpful for spreading conspiracy theories because these are people who are paying attention to information, right? So anti-vaxxers come from the left because they believe that it's not natural for their kids. This is why you see clusters in urban California environments among highly educated people, but who have somehow bought into the idea that we're too industrialized. And you also see it in communities that have traditionally been exploited, that are that have lower economic advantage, that have lower educational achievement, and they're also vulnerable to the information. But one thing that happens in all the circles that I frequent, which are both conservative and liberal, is that each group thinks that it only happens to the other group. And the fact is, y'all, we are all so susceptible to this. And I believe everybody on this call, if somebody, there are many things that I've had to go check out because I'm like, ooh, I want to believe that a little too much. Is that right? There was super example, there was a Facebook video of a woman carrying a sign. Now, this did happen for real at one protest in Illinois, but there was a woman allegedly in New Hampshire carrying a sign that argued for reopening, but also used a familiar Nazi slogan. And that video had been totally fabricated, but man, did my friends circulate it for a full day before the facts caught up. And I think most of them probably still didn't take it down off their walls. So I say this just because none of our hands are totally clean, right? And if everybody's having the same problem, probably means it's a problem we need to address in a structural way. So that's my pitch for us making Facebook fact check posts.
Well, that raises a good follow-up question, which is how can journalists, how can scientists, how can people who are susceptible to confirmation bias and rational thinking, how can we all educate ourselves and, as you say, Betsy, do something structural so that we can make sure that we're getting information in a timely way and information that is credible. You want to start, Julia?
trying to think. I mean, so the way that I personally do it is when this video first came out, I was like, oh wow, this is really well produced and this woman's got a PhD. And then I went to my trusted sources, which is probably what we should do that and then fact check against. And I did end up going to sources that aren't my usual go to, but kind of like weighing the facts, not weighing the facts because there weren't two sides of this argument. Um, it was more looking at who had less skin in the game, I guess. So one of the things that I looked for was like if somebody's producing an article, like you said, Betsy, what was their financial stake in producing this? So that's something that is very common in the anti-vax community is they'll have an article, and at the end of that article, it'll tell you to buy this thing instead of getting your children vaccinated. Um, so that's a big part of what I do to fact check is first of all making sure somebody's not profiting, and second of all making sure that the headline is not inflammatory. Um, and I personally go to a lot of scientific journals, but I know that's not very accessible to a lot of people because of the paywall and because they're awful to read.
But I love your idea of and Betsy, you had raised this too, this question of who benefits by having me believe this. So
Mhm.
that seems like a good sort of baseline question for anybody to ask themselves when they're being asked to believe anything. Betsy, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna pull one thing up just to make sure I'm not being completely idiotic. But so let's move from the structural to the personal. So structurally, I believe we need significantly greater regulation of our information ecosystem in the short term because it's had demonstrable negative effects on our society. Um, and if this were if this were happening in our physical communities, we would regulate it. Because it's happening online, one, we don't have a mechanism for regulation for the most part. And two, again, to the profit motive, Facebook does not have a meaningful profit motive for ensuring that the information on its platform is accurate, fact checked, verified. They basically wash their hands of it, right? Twitter is taking this a great deal more seriously. And Google, like all of these major tech firms in the States, are operating basically as though they have impunity and that there will be no consequences. Versus in Europe, where there is a really strong regulatory mechanism, um, European governments are suing these platforms over their failures and over these things that would violate laws if they happen in person. And they're winning. So it's a little bit, and I've been thinking a lot about jujitsu and personal accountability in jujitsu. I have a friend who is producing the most ridiculous video series. The good news is he knows it's ridiculous, and it is highly produced because he makes great little videos from his home, and his wife has a total knack for this. And they're called Shit That Might Not Work. And that's what these videos are called. And he's a purple belt, and he's a super fun guy, and he's really athletic and flexible. So he will occasionally, and he's training with somebody who's white belt. So he will occasionally get away with something and he'll tape it like, what if this technique could work? Give it a go. Now, here's the thing. Jiu-Jitsu, like science, like journalism, is a verification-based system, right? We know Jiu-Jitsu works because of the first UFC. We know Royce Gracie went out and kicked I just rewatched some of the early UFCs this week. And we know because it's tested. Like, you could groin punch, you could eye gouge, like, come on. So jiu-jitsu people inherently are participating in our sport because they know that it's been battle tested, right? And that that it actually does what it says it will do. And they depend on that credibility. However, there's a lot of crummy jiu-jitsu videos online. My friends are fun because they're intentionally silly, but like there's a lot of really crummy technique videos online that you have to check, or you may get hurt, right? And most people in our academy will, if they see something shiny and cool that they want to see, they'll run it by a black belt at our academy because they know and trust those people. And those people have demonstrated over time their understanding of how Jiu-Jitsu works. So I think to your point, having these trusted sources who you believe have a deeper expert knowledge than you do and leaning into them to help you is really important. Now, you need to make sure that those are good people, right? Who actually can do, they're not, you know, people who just like bought a black belt off of Amazon and opened up a shop in a town with no other jiu-jitsu. The other piece of this that I wanted to kind of flag is, as with jiu-jitsu, there's a regulatory aspect where if you try that stuff without vetting it, there's a negative effect, right? You might luck out and it might work sometimes, or it might never work, or you might get badly hurt. And there's a real consequence. So when we think about structural solutions, I think we need to think about both identifying people who are excellent at vetting information and are good at communicating it. To your point, Julia, like there is a fundamental difference between being super smart and being good at talking. And good at explaining things, and they're different skills. So we need to identify who those people are with some form of verification. So Twitter does this with like the little checkmark verified accounts, right? This is a real person saying a real thing. This is really the celebrity who it purports to be. But I think we also need to have meaningful consequences for people who are sowing discord, sowing misinformation. And that's part of a structural solution, is that this can't be permitted, and we need to treat it as serious an assault on our society as we would any threat of war. And I'm pretty serious about that. You know, if people, this is from my point of view, this is basically the drug wars. Like, bad information is a drug that flows into our country from other places, from people who have a profit motive, and we let them and we don't regulate it. At a personal level, there's a ton that we can do. So my practice is the core ethical values of journalism are pretty simple, and I can boil them down to 4. The first is to seek truth and report it. So, and you have to do that in a very fair-minded way. You have to seek truth, not seek information that supports your point of view. And then you have to tell other people about it. You have to minimize harm. So one other thing that's a real hallmark in these conspiracy theory narratives is that there's a villain, right? And the villain is the worst person ever, and they are an unmixed evil on the face of the earth. Well, responsible reporting acknowledges that humans are complex. So even if you see a story about Harvey Weinstein, you're going to see a story that also mentions the fact that, like, he was a creative powerhouse, which is how he got to this position in the industry. It's going to talk about, you know, you will eventually see pieces about how shocked his friends are, or what a surprise this was to his wife, that this is not an aspect of him she had ever encountered. Good stories don't have pure heroes and villains. Because those are not the models that humans come in. We're all mixed up. The last 2, I think, are the most important for grappling with conspiracy theories, which is act independently. So journalists are often accused of, like, your corporate masters told you to write this thing. And that is true in some newsrooms. Like, there was a famous clip on, I want to say it was on John Oliver's show, of Sinclair Broadcasting anchors all reading the same op-ed. That came down from corporate. I've never seen anything like that in any other newsroom, and I'm so glad someone called attention to its existence, because that gave every journalist I know hard chills. Like, I would quit before I would do something like that. So act independently, which doesn't mean be like some crazy iconoclast who's like, look, sheeple, blah, blah, blah. It means you are looking for the people who have financial independence, who have no potential conflicts of interest. The experts that you call, as you say, Julia, are the ones who don't have a stake in it. Third parties who don't have a dog in the hunt. And those people are the ones that you can trust information. And the last is the simplest: be accountable and transparent. It can be really hard to find the people down the little rabbit trails of information behind conspiracy theories. If you can't find who's behind something in one, maximum 2 clicks, you should not trust that information, period, the end. Like, don't waste your time with it. The internet is easy. You should be 1 click away from the person who wrote it and their contact information. So this
That
is
was actually, to your last point, that was actually something I did for a good 4 hours, was try and find who had funded Plandemic. And I absolutely, there's nothing. There's the production company, but there's no information of where that money is coming from. And that's also something that scientists have to do, is every paper shows the author affiliation and where all of the funding is coming from. So it's not all coming from the university, but you also want to know which university they're working for. But they're usually getting grants from the government and private donors. And they have to disclose every single place they got that money. And that's conspiracy theory videos rarely have that disclosure at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
where does that leave us? What's a good sort of, I mean, I'm sitting here listening to you talk, and I'm thinking to myself, I want a lesson from the two of you and how to do a close reading of something that was reported, a scientific discovery or a scientific development that was reported in a newspaper or a piece of media outlet. But so I mean, I'm hearing so much that's the same or very similar between science and journalism, and I'm wondering, what takeaways would you like for someone who is still skeptical, or who still is sort of like, well, I don't know, I wanna believe this conspiracy theory over here, or I'm not entirely convinced. What message would you leave someone like that with?
So I can dive in. I would say the first thing is, my goal isn't really ever that people see the world the way I see it. And so my message to folks is, one, I want your skepticisms. I'm a journalist because I was born skeptical and then I was trained to be more skeptical. I think skepticism makes the world better. How do you know that? How do we know this is true? This is the fundamental driving force between science, journalism, and being a toddler, right? We all start by asking why and how. And there's a reason for that, which is science and journalism both emerged from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment literally is the concept of bringing light into the world, right? We have emerged from darkness. So anything that moves you closer to skepticism without, I want to be really careful here, without tipping into cynicism. So cynicism is assuming that you know that things are not as they claim to be. Skepticism is examining whether things are as they claim to be. And I think a lot of what we see in conspiracy theories is cynicism, people who feel that the world is shitty and, run exclusively by venal interests that have it out for us personally, right? And it doesn't leave room for a lot of optimism about human nature. So I would say, yeah, be skeptical for sure, but try very hard not to tip into the kind of hard cynicism that means your mind can never be changed and you really can't learn new things.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also, a lot of conspiracy theories and videos require you to believe that every single person in a certain industry is in on this conspiracy and they're hiding it from you. Such as every vaccine scientist would have to be in on this, every person in the government would have to be in on this. And I saw a good analogy, I guess, which was, have you ever worked in a group project with more than like 3 people? because you can't wrangle that many people. Also, most people, I believe, most people are good. Most people want to do what's right, and most people aren't going to be bought off to put the entire world in danger. Which is what a lot of these conspiracy theories want you to believe, is that people, for the right price, hundreds of people will lie to you so that they can meet their ends. And of course, there are corrupt people. That's an unfortunate reality, but it's not the majority of people. Um, and anything that requires hundreds of people to lie to the general public in sync is something that I would take with several grains of salt, because it's just not realistic. And you probably know people in that industry that they're telling you is lying to you, and they're good people. Um, and you just have to put a more human face on it. Like, it's not the big bad sitting up in the high tower. It's your neighbor 2 doors down. It's your aunt, or it's maybe your parents. Like, it's actual human beings that they're accusing of being a Bond villain. And you just need to put it in that context.
I could listen to the two of you talk for much longer, but I will I will let you go. But I hope we can chat again. And Betsy O'Donovan, Julia Kelly, thank you so much for being smart and thoughtful and good at what you do, and for caring and for being willing to chat with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation, Val. This is such a pleasure.
So much.